Hey there, Sterile Processing Universe. This is Bobby Parker from Beyond Clean, and you are watching the gift of low temperature sterilization. We want to thank you for tuning in to this 2CE event. Yes, you heard me right, 2.0 CEs for this event today. On this panel that we're going to have this afternoon, we're going to be discussing the ins and the outs of low temp sterilization. We're going to lay out some key concepts of building an excellent program for your sterile processing department and adding a few practical insights along the way. As always, we would love to hear your feedback. We want to know who you are, where you're tuning in from. So down in that comment section below, please type some comments in there, any questions you have, and we'll try to engage with you along the way. So without further ado, let's bring in our panelists for today's event. All right, welcome in here, panelists. We're going to get things started today with doing a brief intro. So I'm going to kick things over. Let's start with Sean. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go around the clock here.
My name is Sean Weir. I'm a sterile processing educator. Been in the industry for 13 years now.
Awesome. Welcome. Feel free to jump on in there, guys.
I'm Jake McHugh. I've been in the industry for over 14 years and currently tracking system coordinator in Jacksonville, Florida.
Awesome. Love to hear that experience.
Hi, guys. My name is Alessandra Nicholson. I've got 14 years in the sterile processing field and management with a number of hospital systems. And currently, I am working as an educator through my own company, the Condrey Institute of Sterile Processing.
Love it. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Jenny Gibbs. I'm the manager of the Central Sterile Department way up in North Dakota. I've been doing this for about 6 years and very excited about the industry. Been in healthcare a long time, like 30 years, but sterile processing is where I landed and it is my love. So it's good to be in this realm. I love it.
That's great. That's great. Well, you guys, we are, I suppose, ready to get things started here. So let's introduce to our listeners what low temp sterilization is, what is that technology, and how's it used. So real softball on this one. We're going to start it off. Jenny, why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction to low temp sterilization?
So for me, low temp, I would describe it as it's our chemical sterilization. It's, chemical steam and high level disinfection. Those are our modalities, and chemical disinfection is what that is. We have the opportunity to have quite a few different vendors and technology in. So I don't always say it's just H2O2 or it's just this. I definitely use it's chemical or low temp sterilization when I explain it to other people in the org or new employees or people not familiar with the industry. I say it's all the stuff that can't withstand the temp and pressure of steam. So anything that's going to melt or anything that's not stainless steel, basically, or surgical steel, it's going in. We have to do that. And when you tell them what you're putting in there, like they have no concept of, batteries and power equipment and scopes and plastics and cables. And sounds like you're going to the hardware store and but we have to reprocess all of that in that modality with chemicals, vaporized chemicals.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Thanks for that. Anybody want to add anything to that? What low temp sterilization means to you? How's it used in healthcare?
I'd only just add that there's multiple modalities, right? So we typically inside the field, we'll call them by the manufacturer's name or the vendor's name. But we use hydrogen peroxide, we use parasitic acid, we use ethylene oxide. So there's multiple chemicals that we can partake in. And then that also comes with their own processes for management as well. So you can't, put every single one in the same area. Sometimes you're looking at ventilation, handling, making sure you got some chemical gloves back there, things like that. So it can get a little complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts?
I would say that I'm very happy that we don't call this STERRAD modality, because that's my pet peeve. It is called low temp because it is a lower temperature than steam sterilization. And we also have to include in there, like you say, EO gas sterilization, which is still being done across many hospitals.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. It's the old Kleenex versus facial tissue debate. We get we get hung up on one word, but it's much more expansive than that. So yeah, thanks for bringing that out.
I mean, I think everybody hit it on the head. The only one that I didn't hear referenced was ozone.
Yeah. Yeah, that's starting to come into play more these days. You're hearing more about that. So, yeah, thanks for that introduction. As we think about low temp sterilization, and I'm thinking particularly of hydrogen peroxide sterilization, but what are some of the unique considerations or workflows that make low temp sterilization different from how we would handle something that would go through, say, a steam autoclave? Jake, you want to start this one?
Sure. Usually what I think of is that everything has to be 100% dry. I know when you're putting things into steam sterilizers, you still want them to be dry, but when you're putting it in low temp, it has to be bone dry. There's also usually, at least for H2O2, can't be any cellulose or paper. So you have to be careful about count sheets. You have to be careful about what type of filters might be going in if you're using containers. There seems to be a lot more health risks that show up with low temp sterilization than you would think of, especially looking at high temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of real important topics there. When you think about how it makes an impact on how the instruments are moved through, Jake, you talked about instruments being bone dry. What does that look like in a practical level in a department? Jenny, you're currently managing a facility. What does that look like in your department of moving those instruments through a different process?
So we really, how we designed our departments or where they're at, just flow. So we're not coming and going and backing and forth. That, really using lean technology to make that efficient. It's almost like its own service line or area production line within the department. We've got our pass-through window from decontam, because a lot of this stuff is the hand wash or stuff that can't go through the washers as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's the pass-through window, the table, it's right there by our sterilization. We've got that bank to make that efficient. The drying, our instrument air is right there, for blowing it off, and our inspection device is right there as well, to really make sure we've got some of that critical stuff all done with that equipment. A lot of it too is turnover. So because again, yes, it's expensive stuff. It's, mm-hmm. It's your power, it's your Da Vinci scopes. It's, not to say a brand specific, your robotic scopes, I should say, I guess, but it's, there's a lot of really high dollar value stuff. Also flexible endoscopes. And so that all kind of goes through that line. So how you process that, how you think about it, what's that turnover, the communication, so that flow of where it's outlined. The other piece with that for me is really the training that goes into that. And that might be something we're going to talk about later, but it is a very skilled position, very easy to damage this equipment in the sterilizer. I mean, I think every facility has probably left a cap on a scope or not put one and blown up a scope or 2 or 3 in a day. So depending on your team, and your skill level. So there's lots of considerations with that workflow, and it can really impact surgery budget and turnaround and times. And there's a lot that goes into it compared to just normal instrumentation.
Yeah, for sure. As we're thinking about what makes low temp sterilization unique, we've talked about the cost of the devices that go through, the excessive drying and processing it takes to get it bone dry. And I suppose if we were to stop there, we might call this panel the pain of low temp sterilization, but this is the gift of low temp sterilization. All right. So tell me about what makes it unique in a really positive way. Like, what's great about low temp sterilization?
Well, the good things are that it is low temp. And so you're able to almost essentially run anything, of course, that is congruent with the IFU in there. So, we're even to the point where we can run some of our minor stainless steel instruments in those like quick cycles that are on some of those machines now. So that's a plus. And then also, I mean, even though drying is a pain, it's actually something that we found that I think Jake was saying that we actually need to be drying some of the things that are going into our steam sterilization practices. And so putting a process in place that actually assists with drying from, coming from decontam, I think it lifts up the whole process and making sure that everything is getting the right amount of sterilant, touching all the important parts, and that the staff are now cognizant that they actually do need to have the things dry in those areas. And then the last thing I would add is just the time on the cycles, because it can become a pain point with the drying that kind of gets lost sometimes in the translation of calculating how long it's actually going to take to process. But these are typically much shorter cycles than what we have to see in our steam sterilization practice. So we're able to help with that turnover process a little bit better.
for sure.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think the biologicals is a factor that we're all missing out on. I think the biologicals are much more intricate and demanding on, did it meet this criteria, which is exposed for this long, versus this steam is, it only has to hit for 4 minutes and it should kill off all the spores. But with low temp, I think there's a lot more factors that we should incorporate into that education piece too.
Yeah, for sure. And as we get into education in a bit, that'll be fun to dive into. It's interesting you bring that up about the biologicals, because you're right. The different cycles that we have on these low temp sterilizers do very different things, and so that's a challenge for manufacturers to come up with one biological that will test the parameters for all of those different cycles and will actually show a failure if the sterilizer fails. So, yeah, it's a great call out.
I do have a couple more positives. I think
go
for
ahead.
me, the benefit it offers our patients around patient safety, the equipment we can reprocess with a terminal sterilization versus a high-level disinfection, and what this technology opens up to us. There's advancements all the time. Ozone was mentioned earlier. Some of the devices that have a combined hydrogen peroxide ozone cycle, and 510K clearance to do, say, GI endoscopes, or just those additional validations that low temp companies are doing with manufacturers to open it up and allow us to terminally sterilize more critical equipment for our patients is a huge win that we can give back to healthcare in general. And that's something I'm really proud about for for us as an industry to be able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And as you mentioned, the hardware store list of power equipment that's very expensive that goes through there. If we didn't have low temp sterilization, we wouldn't be able to provide those, and we would still be in the OR with hand drills, like, cranking holes through bones. And so, it's a tremendous advancement for sure.
And low temp saved the day too with the pandemic. With mask reprocessing, we had an opportunity to keep up with demand by having those processes in this place.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're listening out there, let us know down below if you had to participate in any, or got the opportunity to participate in any of that pandemic emergency reprocessing of and other devices using low temperature.
That was a gift too, right? Is that the second?
That's right. It was a gift. Yeah.
Okay.
A painful gift. So what do you all think are some of the big misconceptions, or maybe the gaps out there for this modality? What do we need some more education on in this topic? It's another way of asking it.
Handling.
Yeah,
So that's the big thing for me coming out of management is having the experience of staff members getting chemical burns from pulling things out of those machines, out of the low temp machines, and not having the proper gloves on, or just having those available for them in that area. You can have, the best lean process there, but gloves have to be restocked. And I find that that can really be the challenge of somebody just taking the last pair, not putting a new box in, or not having a concrete process where, materials management or someone's going to come through and make sure that it's checked and everything that they need is here. And then disposal as well. And I preach this especially for our EVS partners, because it's easy for us SPD techs to grab those empty cartridges out of the machines and just throw them in the trash. And there are proper ways for us to dispose of all of our chemical processes. So making sure that our staff understand how to protect themselves and how to protect each other.
Yeah. I'm not sure that all of our listeners have had the opportunity to experience or see what hydrogen peroxide burns are like. You want to tell us a little bit about what that experience is like?
Absolutely. So in the best possible scenario, you'll have just like a little flesh color change. It'll change to a white color with that peroxide touching your skin. That's the best possible exposure that you can have. But I think one of the issues is that can sometimes be common because we've just been in the habit of pulling things out without gloves, and that doesn't happen every single time. And then someone gets caught and they have that burn. But it can be very serious. You can get up to a 3rd-degree burn with these chemicals. So you definitely want to be in the practice of protecting yourself and protecting your coworkers.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that discussion, if you're working in a department, to be aware of what the SDS says to do in that situation. And you want to
Yes.
make sure you have that information available and everybody knows it before you're experiencing that in the moment. So
Yes.
if you don't have that education already in place, that'd be a great one. And there's a lot more that we can say about safety, and we're going to get to safety, particularly around hydrogen peroxide, later on in the interview, but that's a great call out. Thanks for that.
I would like to see more education on what happens in the chamber at every phase of the machine. I mean, we know with steam, it's very simple to understand, but what actually goes on inside the chamber of a low temp sterilizer?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a very different practice, very different mindset, and because of that difference in modality, I think that's a lot of why we have all the limitations for size of lumens, length of lumens that we can put in our low temp sterilizers. We don't see those things showing up, or those requirements showing up as frequently for steam sterilization, and I think that has everything to do with the chemistry there. So if somebody out there has a bigger chemistry brain than I do and wants to share some thoughts on that real briefly, you're welcome to. But that's a great call out, that we need more of that type of education coming out, if not from our sterilizer manufacturers, from just experts in the field.
That was on my list too, the efficacy of that cycle and how do you know it's really sterile. And that ties into, again, your comment on the biologicals and why they're complex. And if you have multiple different manufacturers, I have, I think, 4 different vendors or 3 different types of machines. It's to understand how each one works differently. What is the BI? Do you use a common BI? Do you use aftermarket? Do you use the manufacturer? And then understanding that cycle. What does it mean when there's error or this, or you get an error, and understanding some of those things? That's a lot of education for our team to really manage and operate that equipment effectively so it's safe for our patients.
100%. I'd love to piggyback on that and just saying that it seems to me, and I may be wrong, but it seems to me in the low temp area is where we'll have the highest range of products and companies that we're using in the same space. So like with the high temp sterilization, if I'm buying containers, I'm typically able to just buy the same container from the same company. But with low temp, sometimes the companies will have their own specialized containers. So you may end up with even 3 or 4 different vendors of just the outside container or the tape or the integrators. And that's a little bit different than coming out of the steam space. And it can get a little complicated for the technicians to navigate.
One size does not fit all.
No, and sometimes techs will just take it upon themselves to say, okay, well, this filter from this company can go in this tray. It fits, it's kind of like UPS. It fits, it ships. And they will, make a way to cover that filter panel. And it increases the amount of materials that you have to carry, because I have to have that containers, their filters, and maybe I have a different set of locks than I need for this container. And so it can really become an opportunity to streamline, even just from a materials aspect, how much you're purchasing through your low temp sterilization.
For the containers in general, is that, you buy the ones for steam, you buy the ones for low temp, the lids start getting mixed. They look very similar.
Yes.
And then they have ones that can go through both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It gets complicated fast.
Good points on all that. I know it was said before, when is the industry going to standardize the color change of the class 1 indicators? And with that, I want to kind of piggyback on something that I might stir the pot up a little bit, which I'm good for. At what point do we move away from a class 1 indicator and change it for the different modalities? We all know that a company has, let's call it a class 4 type indicator for low temp sterilization. When are we going to see a change in EO gas sterilization for a different indicator, or put inside the trays or the wraps? With low temp hydrogen peroxide, that class 4 is something unique and different to the world that we're into now. How can we incorporate that more and more into the other modalities?
Yeah, it's a great call out. Thinking about wanting that same standard of care for all of our patients, that we get the same degree of sterility assurance regardless of which modality we've picked. And you're right, looking at this industry, there are definitely some big step downs from the level of sterility assurance that we have in steam sterilization to just what products we have at our available to us for the other modalities.
I think that goes into a big misconception with chemical sterilization or low temp, is that it's easy. There's nothing to it.
Yeah.
It's so easy. You just put it in, and it, you don't need to worry about how you stack it, how it goes in there, like what's, are they touching, are they not? Like there's so much different. It's actually more complex or just as complex with how the efficacy of the device and the device cycle and how it works and what do you need and what's your surface area, and just different things like that people just don't see. And I think if people, even outside of major medical organizations, people will get a low temp sterilizer and they're just, oh, it's easy. I just put it in and it does this and easy peasy. And it's not, it's so complex and there's such a high risk. And I think that's, for me, one of the other biggest misconceptions is it's not easy. It needs a lot more attention than it is given.
Yeah.
100%.
As we talk about all of these different machines having different cycles that all do different things, Jake, I wanted to ask you a question. With that background as an instrument coordinator, I imagine you spend a lot of your time with instrument IFUs and looking at cycle compatibility. So what misconceptions or gaps do you see out there in low temp sterilization and just interpreting all the IFUs?
I mean, the main ones I see are that even if you're looking at low temp sterilizers from the same company, similar cycles are not able to reprocess all the same instruments. You have to make sure that the IFU states this machine, this cycle, and that you have that cycle available, because you might have purchased a new instrument and now you found out, oh wait, I got to buy another cycle to add on to my machine potentially. And that just basically that's it. And it gets even worse if you have multiple manufacturers, because now we're talking about not only the instruments, but the tapes, the containers, the indicators, the biologicals. It rolls downhill. But that's probably the number one, is that, one cycle doesn't fit all.
Right.
Oh. And typically in the IFUs, it's very common to see it be brand specific. And that can become a challenge because, again, we're repeating, you may have multiple machines from multiple vendors. And so when you get that IFU and it has that branded language on there, it could become a struggle of, okay, now what next? Because it's not simple for me to get the other machine,
right?
And be like, oh, well, I just need another $100,000 so I can get this particular machine for this one item, and everything else can go in the other space.
Yep. So
I think that goes into a higher level discussion on IFUs and standardization of IFUs by oversight, and should it be brand specific and it shouldn't. And I mean, there's a lot of things with that. I mean, steam is steam, but it is that IFU, that's another whole rabbit hole. You talked about those rabbit holes. That's one, that's a hot button for me, is there is no standardization. If you look at the aviation industry, every IFU on operation manual for every plane is outlined exactly the same. There's core requirements in each aspect of that manual, and that is not the same with instruments. They can be 2 pages of really nothing, or they can be so complex that you can't even do them. And it's not right, and it's not fair to our patients and us as health professionals who are trying to follow those standards for safe patient care. It's a big gap.
It's a huge gap.
There can even be IFUs that are structured by serial number. So all these items can go into this machine on this cycle. But if it's a serial number after this, then it can go into these additional ones. And I've even gone down the rabbit hole with one instrument manufacturer where I was told it can go through this process, but I had to get 5 different letters that said this item is comparable to this item, and these items are now allowed to go through this process, even though it's not on the IFU, and those follow this item. It was a daisy chain.
Yeah. So Jake, help our hearers out with this issue. So you have an IFU in front of you that's brand specific. Is your only option to go purchase a different device or a different sterilizer, or is there some work that a hospital or a facility can do to stay compliant?
So I would reach out first to the instrument manufacturer because they may have an updated or a letter of addendum to those IFUs. And then I would also reach out to the sterilizer manufacturer because they may have some other documents. And if they contradict, I would always go right back to the instrument manufacturer to make sure there's nothing that's been forgotten or missed.
Yeah, no, that's great.
And work on your process too. Sometimes it's just a purchasing issue. If you don't have a strong purchasing program that includes a review from sterile processing before you buy, because this stuff is not like Walmart, you cannot just return it. And I can't tell you how many times I've gotten instruments from like clinic managers and OR directors, and they're like, I have this new shiny thing and the doctor's here next week and he's so excited. And can you sterilize it? And the answer is no, because before I'm able to do that, now I've got to do what Jake just said. I've got to make some calls and I've got to see if I can get some letters, and hopefully I can get that information. Otherwise, we may be having a tough conversation with materials management.
Yeah. I would say there are some other options. So like if you have a different brand that's not listed in the IFU, a different manufacturer, that manufacturer might have its own validation or compatibility matrix. Right. You can also look at and it's always a mix, and it's always a judgment call, if, in my opinion, if we're going to be honest, because you have the chemical, you have the machine, you have the device. You always have to line them up. None of them, very rarely, always are like, oh, we planned all of this together between all of us. So it's always this decision-making tree, basically. And I think, you know, if you always go to the highest, as long as you're not contradicting the IFU and you go to the highest level of safety, you know, there are some things, if you, again, you can involve your risk management team, your infection control team, you can do your own internal risk assessment or gap assessment, especially if you're looking at some stuff, if you are, say, surveyed by Joint Commission. And there is a process for some of that to be involved in an interdisciplinary team on how you mitigate that when you have competing IFUs. But to use the technology that you have, because it's not, the days are over where there is a monopoly just by one manufacturer, but a lot of those IFUs were written potentially at that time. And so it is a thing. You need to have a process and be able to speak to that, say under survey, just what your process is. And as long as you don't contradict the IFU, again, that's your starting point. I'm not going to say you're going to be okay, but that's your starting point for the conversation.
Right. But no, that's a helpful discussion. It really is a discussion to be had, and a process to work through. Well, let's talk a little bit about how we navigate the low temp sterilization in our departments. Can you all share any best practices about setting up a high performance low temp sterilization process in a department?
Well, I think one of the basics of it is just making sure that those processes are separate. And this may go all the way up your chain into decontam, you know, separating your hand wash items from the things that are going to go into the washer, and making sure that folks are educated about how to handle them. You know, like she said earlier, can't tell you the heart sinks when you leave that cap off and you just ruin things. And that can really start in decontam when we're talking about low temp, because there's usually going to be some type of cord or plug that's going to have some pins that may or may not be able to be submerged. So you're definitely going to want to start there. And then, of course, point of use as well, making sure that your scrub techs and your nurses in the rooms understand how these things work. One of the scariest experiences that I've ever had was we were rounding for anesthesia, and we found that their scopes had been hanging far too long, you know, for their process. And so we moved them over to a low temp sterilization, and that actually meant that they were going to go into a container. And our end users had never seen that container before, even though they were in the OR, they were, you know, not on that side. And they actually had trouble intubating simply because they couldn't get the container open. So you really do want to go step by step and make sure that everybody has the information they need. And then, of course, on the assembly side, making sure that you can have that drying process there, however that looks for you. The larger facilities that I've worked in, they've even gone so far as to separate low temp assembly from steam sterilization, so that there's not, you know, droplets of water on the tables, or because there's nothing worse than wrapping that thing and pressing start and hearing that red bing that there's H2O2 detected.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest thing for me was, if you're setting up a new department or you have the ability to have construction, you have that clear separation, as you said, throughout the whole process. So the hospital I worked at last, we had decontam, we had the tray side, and we had the manual cleaning sinks. And then from there, it went into the dryer. And then from the dryer, there was a workstation on the opposite end next to the low temp sterilizers where nothing hit that shelf, that workstation besides low temp items.
Yes.
And there was no steam tape, no steam integrators, nothing. It was all low temp based. I think that's the biggest thing you can do in an industry, if you have the ability to do so, is have clear separation. If you don't, it's very crucial to have that secondary orientation on these are the differences between the two, and here's why.
I think one of the easiest things in that scenario is even to just have different racks that they go onto. So they're not all queuing on the same rack to be loaded. You know, we have definitely a smaller rack that's smaller with our low temp items. And then our steam all goes on the opposite end of the sterilization desk. And again, it follows those paths. So that is something we've had success with as well.
And for facilities that have a tracking system, utilizing that tracking system, you can enter in pop-ups. So if you're scanning that low temperature item through different parts of the process, there could be reminders that show up like, hey, don't submerge this. Hey, this one always goes on this cycle. Remember to put your gas caps on. Remember to take your gas caps off, depending on what type of device it is.
Yeah.
So
that may be a hard stop in our tracking system. That's a hard stop on scopes. And then also like for our GI flexible endoscopes that we're terminally sterilizing in low temp, only certain people can do it. So that's limited by our tracking system to make sure that those people contain those have those validations and can actually do that complex piece of equipment. So yes, definitely that tracking system is a good thing.
So you all mentioned having pop-ups and stops in the tracking system. Who has the scariest or worst horror story related to improperly processing a low temp item?
Hey.
I mean, I've seen mine in my days, but I'm not gonna.
I'm gonna say there's so many.
I've seen TE probes put into the autoclave to dry.
Yes.
Because there was no dryer.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And, you forget about that and come back 6 hours later and there's a melted TE probe.
Yeah.
Is it a dollar value question?
Yeah, I'm about to say the TE probes
Is it a
plague
dollar
me
value?
because these items may seem small. They may be compact, but they are so expensive. A TE probe can run you almost 80 grand, depending on what type of specialties you're talking about. So I've had that too, where techs put them into the right machine, but left the caps on, and then all of that corded material was just blown out due to the pressure. So it happens, and it's almost like a parent walking up on a kid that made a mistake because you don't want to overreact. Like, I know you feel bad about it, but also I gotta go talk to somebody about that 80 grand we just lost.
That's right. Yeah.
When you're being rushed, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, you were rushing to need this, and now you don't have it, and now somebody has to have that crucial conversation of not only do we not have it, it's no longer functional.
Yeah. And I think to tag off on that, when I think about what are those best practices that have been successful for us, one is instrumentation volume, whether that's using analytics or our instrument tracking system, our load documents coming out of the machines. What are we actually putting in there? How many times am I turning that piece of power every single day? What, that I sit on the capital committee, that I, as a manager, am equally aligned with the surgery manager, and it's a discussion on what equipment we need and a big component isn't just maybe what surgery or the physician wants, it's what does CSD need based on turnaround pressures and timings and technology. If our gap is low temp sterilization because I'm at max capacity and I can't turn anymore, then I either need another sterilizer or I need more instruments so I don't have to turn it in the day. So understanding those statistics in your department, especially for those in leadership, are really essential to make sure that you're taking care of your team and that they don't have those unnecessary turnaround or pressure gaps, or that they have the tools and equipment they need to do their job and to support surgery, that they get that too. So that is that turnaround pressure instrumentation level is a huge best practice that we've been successful at. And it's just always a mix of to make sure you have what you need when you need it.
You definitely want to keep an eye on it, because this process is the most fickle process. So this is where you're going to have the most loads fail. And you don't want to be in the middle of turnover and that's the only one available. And now the cycle has failed and you got to rewrap and go through this process. And trying to get your partners to understand what just happened is almost impossible during that time, right? So like, I love what you said about being a part of the capital management process and having those conversations there to let them know, like, yes, your logic sounds good. You have 3 procedures a day, so you're going to buy 3 scopes, but, and being able to come in and add, but we got to look at the turnover time. We have to look at the staffing. We have to look at the process and what we're capable of.
And Amy put out an interesting document probably 6-7 years ago on equipment management, and it gave like a playbook on who needs to be at the table at different parts of equipment considerations. So again, a blessing of best practices in that capital assignment, new equipment assignment, our CSD is on the list. Like, it's a box you have to check. If it has anything, it doesn't need to be reprocessed. It comes to me as a hard stop to review the IFU before it even gets down the chain of, is it actually going to be considered? It's if we're even going to consider vetting it. And that reviewing the IFU. So that is another, again, a big thing that leadership can do, or surgery leadership who maybe oversees the CSD as well. Make sure we're at the table, having that partnership with infection control, surgery leadership, materials management. We all need to be in partner. And that's what that Amy document outlined. That was a real aha for me about 6 years ago when I found it. And I plopped it down and here we go. Can we do this? So
yeah.
One thing I've seen that's been left behind at some facilities is making sure you have an end of life plan for some of those. Because, you might be, especially if you're a small hospital, you got the 1, if you're lucky, 2 low temp sterilizers, and they've been there for 15 years. Eventually they're going to stop functioning.
Yes.
And you need to have a plan to make sure you have funding and what you're going to purchase, and that all the equipment that, if it's not the exact same thing, is going to be, processable in that.
Yeah, and with that, you have to, it's a little different because you have to look at, sometimes that end of life may be simply the number of years you maintain that machine. But a lot of times with low temp, it may be the number of cycles that you're running with those machines. So, one may come before the other. So you definitely want to be having a plan in place and paying attention to where you are with that.
Can we talk too about your PM schedule on those machines? Might not be a set 6-month cycle or quarterly cycle. It might be on your cycle counts. And if that stops and the machine says, you can't use me anymore, how long till you get your vendor in? So some things to do with some of that as well.
Yeah, that's definitely a discussion to have, particularly at a busy facility that's only got 1 or 2 machines. They're going to move through those cycles much faster than the expected number of months before that PM shows up. So as we're talking about best practices, and I'm Johnny Clipboard with my sterile processing department, and I want to have my workflows be separate. I want to make sure that my scopes are washed with the right caps in the right places. I want to make sure things are dry going in, that they're unloaded appropriately, but I don't get to put my hands on those instruments for most of the cycles. I'm training technicians to do that. What best practices have you all used or seen related to education that would help a department be able to succeed at some of the things we've talked about, of having the workflow stay separate, getting things appropriately dry, making sure the caps are in the right places, that we don't put the TEU probe into the sterilizer, those types of things?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the low-hanging fruit, I think, is just the frequency in which we train. So oftentimes in sterile processing, we may only educate when the thing is new, right? When the machine gets installed, or when we add a new cycle, or we buy a new piece of equipment. And because these are really foundational skills that we want to make sure the staff are competent on, it's not acceptable to do just a yearly competency. You want to make sure that you have a process in place that at a certain time, whether it's monthly, bi-monthly, however you want to do it, that you're coming back to some of these basic concepts and you're catching that drift. This is how we're going to eliminate the staff, running things on the wrong cycle, or using the wrong processes, or not using their gloves, even though they know that they're supposed to have them, right? Just having these consistent reminders about some of these foundational skills, I think, is really, really critical.
One thing I would like to do with anybody, especially if they're brand new, never used a low temp sterilizer before, hand them the user manual and say, read this cover to cover, but I want you to start at the safety chapter. So they're going to read what they need to use when they're loading, unloading, if and when there's a load failure. after they finish that chapter, then they can go from chapter 1 through, because if they're not taking care of themselves, they're much less likely to be taking care of the instruments for the patients.
Definitely. And I love
Yeah.
the concept of like teaching them how to use the brake before we give them the gas.
That's right.
Slow down.
Jake's got a cruel idea of a training program here. Welcome to sterile processing. Now read this technical manual. But, no, I hear what you're saying, and safety, particularly related to low temp sterilizers, is a theme that comes up a lot and is real important to talk about. So let's hit pause real quick on best practices, because I do want to circle back around to education and talk a little bit about safety that's so important with low temp sterilizers. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that topic in general? Like, what are some of those safety pieces that we need to make sure that we're aware of?
One thing we've implemented that I believe pretty strongly in is, and I've gotten support higher up, is, there's different guidelines which you have to do officially as far as BI indications. We've been blessed with and pushed for to do BIs in every load in our low temp sterilization, and primarily for patient safety. The efficacy, the complexity of the devices, the cycles, just all of that is so complex. But then to the recall process, because everything is, a lot of it during the day is on rapid turn and going right back up to the OR if we're reprocessing it that day. To have to do the recall for patient safety. It ties a little bit into our education. I would challenge, do areas have, or facilities have, a recall policy? Does surgery write it, or do you write it, or is it written together? And what is your process in that? And is all your staff educated on that? Is that an annual competency? Or high risk, low volume, if you use that mentality, we do quarterly quizzes that go out electronically. And then if somebody doesn't pass us at a certain level, then our compliance and application analyst will meet with them, and he's in charge of all of our sterilization validations, so to meet with them and do some observations and make sure they've got that, so the recall, the operation of the devices, the daily checks, the operation of that equipment, the records of, are you doing the daily, the hourly, the weekly, whatever that is, the chamber cleaning, different things like that you really need to know and assure your team knows. Do you have a policy on that? Do you have a procedure on that? Do you have a skill validation on that? I think our sterilization area, given our amount of equipment, probably has about, I think, 10 skill validations before they're signed off as a new employee on different aspects of that process, just lending to how critical some of that stuff is. So that's a really good place to start. And how do you assure that your staff are going to be safe and your patients are going to be safe? We're responsible for assuring their competency. It's not for them to take it on their own. We have to give them the tools and the time and the education to make sure that they're safe.
Yeah.
Another piece I think is educating our partners. Oftentimes, you're going to have to round back with infection control, maybe risk management, depending on how you're doing your disposal. You may need to talk with your EVS partners. So just making sure that that education doesn't stop with sterile processing, so that you are able to, branch out and use the resources that are available to you.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We talked also about unloading the sterilizer and using gloves to do that, to make sure that we don't have any of those hydrogen peroxide burns. Another discussion that comes up frequently around this topic is hydrogen peroxide vapors and concerns surrounding that. Do you all have any thoughts around that topic?
I have more outrages than thoughts.
More outrageous? Okay.
So,
I have more questions than thoughts.
right? It's just it's just a big gray area for us.
Yeah.
Ethylene oxide is clear, but vaporized hydrogen peroxide and ozone are not.
Right.
I'm curious what everybody else thinks.
I would definitely reach out to your environmental safety partners and see if you can pull them in and get them to back purchasing any like air quality testing units for whatever system you might have, because that's it's important. It's your safety.
Yes.
I just wish there was.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wish there was more than one company that had a monitoring device, because then it's not so one-sided. And hey, what are they really testing?
Mm-hmm.
Is it something that's supposed to be, or is it just maybe something that's made up?
Hence all the questions I have.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Sean,
it's
I think
tough
you and I are
because-
very aligned on some subjects here.
Right. It's tough because if you call the companies and you ask them if it's safe, they're going to say yes. Right.
Right.
And even if we were to ask them for all of their research to prove it, is that something that I can translate to my team? I probably can't even read it myself. Right. So making sure that the manufacturers are giving us digestible information about how they are keeping us safe. You know, how is this machine evacuating anything that's left over? How are the container systems designed not to spill, you know, or to alarm if there's a spill? Some of the color changes, just making sure that information is really readily available. You know, in SPD, we're dealing with so many different chemicals, and this typically comes up a lot for me when I have team members that are pregnant, and it's the first thing that they ask is this safe? And I don't always have a great way that I can, you know, assuage their concerns, or even with their physicians. I'm like, I don't really know. I mean, we can put a monitoring device on, but to your point, how do I know that you're 100% safe?
Sure. Yeah, it's a big question. And to say that, you know, if there was a problem, we would smell it. You know, our noses do not.
It doesn't work like that,
Yeah,
right?
they don't work
and
that
these
way.
are things
and they,
that will show up later on, right? So we're talking about fumes.
right.
So
Yeah.
this is not, I'm going to breathe it in and then next week I'm showing symptoms. This may be, you know, 20, 30 years of being in the field, and then 20 years out, I'm developing some type of cancer that's related to this. And there have been some larger cases, especially around ETO, that have come up. I know Georgia, and I believe there's another state, but it's not coming to me, but I know Georgia right now is working on some new legislation. Delaware was the other place, but they're working on some new legislation around increasing restrictions on ETO manufacturing plants. And it's something that we don't use as much in the facility because it kind of gotten drove out, but it's coming back in because of scopes.
Yeah.
So you're seeing an education gap there, but almost all of our products that we use that are sterilely packaged are, you know, going through some type of chemical process. So you want to be mindful, because it's not just the safety for us inside the facility, it's the safety for our community. You know, if these companies are dumping or, you know, things like that, and how it could be, you know, affecting our land, our water, and the, you know, the resources that we use in our areas.
Yeah.
I think there's another concern of, say there is, again, something in the machine that isn't working, or you have residual chemical on your packaging. I've had staff question, you know, because again, have you had a surge tech up in the OR, or, you know, it goes on beyond our department, who have gotten some chemical burns? And is it possible to burn the patient? Is it residual on the equipment that's inside of there? And I think that goes just so strongly to why you have to make sure your machines are maintained and functioning, and staff are so highly trained, because there is a risk to the end users and the patients on this if it's not done right.
Yeah, you're absolutely
that
right.
would be interesting, a residual H2O2 test, like a swab, or, you know.
Something, right?
Yeah.
It definitely seems almost like the redheaded stepchild of sterilization, in that the innovation is slower. Like even with the biologicals, it's only been a few years that you were able to do a rapid readout. Before, it was a 24-hour wait. And to your point about recalls, that means that I have been running instruments, turning over instruments. Some of these cameras and scopes may have been used 4, 5, 6 times in that 24-hour period before I get the result that says it's an issue. You know, and let alone do we know if that hospital is running every load monitoring even now that they're able to, you know, just because in the past the practice was 24 hours. So making sure that, you know, there is some innovation in this space.
So as we're talking about safety and keeping our team members safe and our patients safe, Jenny, you really lifted up education as the key to doing that. And as you described earlier, that you have different tiers of education going on with the technicians in your department, that probably sounds foreign to a number of our listeners. And so can I shine a spotlight on that real quick and just ask you to give us a brief picture of what those different competency checks look like, and kind of how you arrived at the model that you did?
We looked at every complex piece of equipment. So for sure, every single piece of equipment in the department has its own procedure for operation, and then an associated skill validation. So whether it's our washer, our cart washer, our ultrasonic, because each one has different operational checks. I mean, and they need to be competent in all of those areas. And it's our job to assess that competency to make sure that they're safe to operate it. Then we look at our major operating procedures in there. So we have a sterilization procedure and skill validation on the flow of what you need to do, what are your job tasks. It's not a task list. It's really like high level, like this is our, and there's a difference between a procedure and a policy. A policy would be that we don't do immediate use sterilization, but our procedure is this is how we do a rapid process, or how we have to do things. It has to be wrapped. It has to have this on the inside. Our complex medical equipment, so like all of our GI endoscopes have their own procedure and skill validation. And then we have a high level disinfection procedure and skill validation, and a scope decontamination procedure and skill validation. We have a general instrument assembly procedure and skill validation. And then there's, say, maybe, and in that there's some specific things listed, but then we have specific skill validations if it's very complex. So our robotic arms, our our shavers, or laparoscopic instruments, things that have specific testing that you need to do, all have that specific skill validation. For sterilization, again, it's each equipment, whether it's different models of the same steam sterilizer or the same manufacturer, but different models of our low temp, they all have their own unique aspect. And then just some of those higher level things, QC and documentation is one that we have for our decontamination area and our sterilization area, because that's a whole thing unto itself. That's the legal record for sterilization. And we need to make sure they know where you mark, how you mark it, and that we validated that they're compliant in there. And then the recall is another one. So
yeah.
Is that what you wanted me to speak to?
Sure, yeah, and thanks for sharing that. And I think everybody's like eyes widen a bit on our listeners. Like that sounds like a lot of documentation, but to your point earlier, being able not just to have an annual kind of verbal, assessment of whether somebody can do the job, being able to do that skill validation of seeing that our technicians can do all the complexities of what we're asking them to do is really crucial for keeping people safe. So thanks for sharing that.
Some of those are annual, and some of them are one and done. So on orientation, you do maybe this one, but then our like high risk, low volume, where are your hits and misses, like where is your biggest risk? Those maybe are an annual. And then again, we do the, you have to be proficient. So do you, like if you're trained in GI endoscopes to reprocess those and do that high level disinfection, you have to do so many scopes every 6 months to stay proficient, or I need to make sure you're scheduled in there so you have that proficiency so you don't lose some of that. And that's another thing, is people like to work in one area and maybe not, but you need them to cover that on the weekend. So are you assured that they actually have the tools? That's my job, to make sure they have the tools to do their job.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Well, as we're getting closer to wrapping up, I want to invite all of you with me to dream for a minute. What do you think that the future of low temp sterilization looks like? Or I guess more specifically, what do you want low temp sterilization to look like in the future?
Well, I mean, I think we've said it over and over again that we want to see it streamlined, and at both the facility and at a high level. We do need some multidisciplinary takes from manufacturing on to regulation. Does the FDA, does the CDC, does Joint Commission, do they all understand what they're looking at? Are they putting their minds together to come up with a process that's more streamlined and move some of this guessing out of our process? Because you don't want to have that when we're talking about sterile goods for patients. I don't want anybody to have to be a magician, So getting those IFU streamlined, removing some of this verbiage that is brand specific, and just really offering a higher quality of care with this process.
Yeah,
I'm bored with the standardization too. And what I don't want to see, and I may be the one and only person in the world that doesn't want to see this, I don't want to see a quicker readout on the BI. Because truly, how much are we really testing in a 10, 12, 15-minute BI? I like the 24. I like 20 minutes. I don't want to see anything quicker than that. I maybe for EO, I would like to see something better than 4 hours, but for low temp and steam, I think they're perfect where they're at right now. So not what the future is, but what they should not do, in my opinion.
Yeah. And piggybacking on that, I'm hoping that it becomes less and less common to pull low temp items before the BIs get read. But just because of the history, it's very common to grab those items and take them straight to the room before that BI gets read. And we don't do the same level of due diligence of, getting a sign off and everything with that process.
So I'll say that we do not let nothing leave the shelf until it is 100% BI read
Yeah,
Mhm.
we need
unless they
that.
sign off. Yeah.
I agree with you.
I would hope in the future that these machines will become more safer, whether that's residual chemical fumes, care and handling after the load, the implementation of the chemical sterilant, just trying to make it more safer for both the patient and the staff that are using it.
Yeah. And from a tech perspective, I'm hoping that we see them become higher capacity. Just having wider bodies that we can fit more things into. It's possible to run into an item that just does not fit in your low temp sterilization machine. So having some more ability to put more items in there, whether it's by pounds or just by sheer volume.
And there is a difference. And I would say for me, the future, some of it's already happening. There are updates to technology. There is new technology. Some do have higher capacity. Some do have different efficacy with ozone components. I mean, that is out there.
Yeah.
And I think to push the other manufacturers just to make them safer and have that efficacy. My dream is to eliminate high level disinfection. Period.
Yes.
It's not
Out of here.
whether it's a safe scope for every patient every time. Why is there a difference on who gets what, and why is that okay to not have terminal sterilization for something that's a medical device that's going to affect somebody? Small scale, I want to pass through so I can keep my areas separate, like my steam, where it comes in on the clean side and goes out on the sterile side. But for me, it's just continued evolution and push of that evolution of the technology and the devices that can go in that, and the elimination of high level disinfection, which I think low temp is our way to do that. So
That is coming very soon. A pass-through low-temp sterilizer.
I have heard.
I mean, they already
I
have.
already have a high capacity one. Now I just need it to be a pass-through.
The only
That's
bad
funny.
part about the pass-throughs, though, is you have to have the construction
The construction.
or the location to have that happen.
Right.
Like with the pass-through scope washers, I love them. I've known about them before they hit the market. It was an absolute phenomenal design that they created, but unless you have the area to incorporate them, it would never work.
Yeah.
Unless you build a wall.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely different. One of the appeals to these low temp sterilizers, though, has always been just set up the electric, plug it in, and you're running, So, Sean, I'll give you the last word here. You gave us your dystopian future of what you don't want to see, but what do you see as the biggest opportunity? What do you want to see the future of low temp sterilization look like?
Really, I'm happy where I'm at with it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind having a larger chamber, but then again, you get into more complexities of what's really going on and what can we put in there? What's the poundage? With the tracking software, do we track the weight of each load per each shelf? Bigger's not always bigger on a chamber size.
Yeah.
It just creates more of a hassle. And then does your manager or team leads want you to run a full chamber or just one item?
Yeah.
I think right now it's good. I think it'd be safer.
More on sterilant and all that. Yeah.
I think there should be more monitoring devices out in the world versus just having one. I think that's something I would want to change.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard some people dreaming and thinking about having low temp sterilizers, incorporating that monitor into the unit itself, so that you're not having to go to another system and purchase it. But yeah, having a safer system that can process more devices at the same time, or at least a larger scope of devices, as we talk about flexible scopes, there's definitely a lot of room to run here. Well, you all, we are right at the top of our time, and so I want to thank all of you for spending this time with us, joining us in this awesome conversation. I heard a bunch of different perspectives from 4 very different backgrounds, and so thank you for your interaction. Also want to give a shout out to you, audience, for your interaction down below. We see you and we hear you. Don't forget to grab your CE credit by visiting the link in the comment section. Thanks for spending your time with us here at Beyond Clean, and until next time, we invite you to keep fighting dirty.